Welcome to Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, Preventionist and Community Advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault. Emerging evidence in sexual violence prevention increasingly points towards the need to involve men as allies. Sexual violence is widely recognized as a serious public health issue. It is also widely acknowledged that sexual violence is perpetrated primarily by men against women, so it would stand to reason that any successful primary prevention plan requires men as allies. So joining me today is Josue Arguelles, a trainer with A Call to Men. Why is engaging men as allies so crucial in the prevention of sexual violence?
Thank you, Deb. Happy to be here. Thank you for these thoughtful questions. As I think about the critical need, right, of engaging men in the prevention of sexual violence, it's really because it's a men's issue, right? And we have to frame it as such because men, male-identified folks, really have a particular role and responsibility in preventing but also ending sexual violence against all women and girls. And so when we talk about men and their need to be at the table and part of these conversations, and in particular, I'm going to say like Black and brown men, right? Black and brown men really have understanding of, when we need white folks to be at the table in conversations around racism, right? And being anti-racist. Also understanding that women and non-man identified folks are calling us men to the table, right? That we need to be at the table and we need to really be addressing our responsibility and our actions and how we're preventing sexual violence because it is happening at the hands of cisgendered heterosexual men and the numbers will show that. So there's really critical that men's voices and men's leadership and influence is part of this conversation as well.
Now, one of the primary ideas with A Call to Men is healthy masculinity and breaking out of the man box. Now, can you expand on what the man box is and how being in there prevents healthy masculinity?
Yeah, absolutely. So the man box really is our kind of entry point conversation, right, with men and boys around the rigid notions of manhood and masculinity. It's really about the teachings of manhood that have been passed down, right, from my generation to the next and the generation before me, right? Like what I've been taught about manhood from my dad and my grandfather and my brothers, right? It's about how to show up as men, the roles and responsibilities of men, these kind of unwritten rules, right, of what men have to behave like, what men have to say, how do they prove their manhood. And also the man box is really talking about a formula that we at A Call to Men believe creates fertile ground for the violence against all women and girls to exist. And that's the teachings that women have less value than men, that women are to be objectified, and that women are property of men, right? And so when we talk about the man box, we really have to understand that what holds it together and what makes other men check other men and younger men into the man box is really heterosexism, right? And the product of that we see is homophobia and transphobia. And we can see the high rates of violence that it impacts, right, on queer communities, LGBTQ, trans and non-binary communities. And so when we talk about the man box, we also are talking about how do we then promote healthy masculinity, healthy manhood, right? Because we're not saying everything in the man, like about being a man is necessarily bad, right? There's some things like, if you want to be a protector, you want to provide for yourself and your community, those are absolutely good responsibilities and traits. But how are we doing that at the expense of other people? And are we doing that particularly at the expense of women and girls? And so for us to move outside of the man box is really about living our true authentic self, right? And the way we model that, our true authenticity, is really important. And it's critical because then it serves as an example for the generation below us, right? The next generation of manhood, as we call it, right? And so we really have to consider how we are using our role and our influence to model that authenticity.
So in addition to healthy masculinity, many of your trainings also deal with racism and marginalized populations. Can you talk about how these intersectionalities contribute to the issues surrounding sexual violence and what can be done about them?
Yeah, so we know it's important to have an intersectional analysis, right? We really do our heart of our work is really community organizing. But we really have an intersectional approach, right? And we have to talk about the intersections of race, of trauma, of class, in particular when we're talking about young brown and black men, right? Because we have these internalized responses to systemic violence that carries over into how our young brown and black men are responding to their communities, right? How they're responding to their relationships with women in their lives, with the people in their family. And so when you have these experiences that are impacting young black and brown men around race in particular, right, that they understand the marginalization that they experience as black, indigenous, or people of color, but they still carry the male privilege. We still carry the male privilege. And so it's really about understanding how are we recognizing that privilege in particular spaces, and really, understanding that there's going to be spaces that we're going to walk into as men that we have to be making space for other marginalized populations. Or we call it like populations that live in the margins of the margin. And so we have to understand when we're making space for those voices and those experiences to be centered versus when we are walking into spaces where those voices or those stories are not even in the room. And so how do we amplify those voices, right? In particular, survivors' voices, in particular, the voices of women of color, of indigenous women, right? Or more specifically of black trans women. Because we believe, I don't call it to men, that we have to center those voices, those experiences, right? We call it centering the margins of the margins. And that we see ourselves, as men connected to those experiences, right? And that we all benefit if we can center those voices that are often left out or erased, and that specifically in our action of centering that contributes to a world where we're creating that safety and creating that worth to the margins of the margins.
You also look at adverse childhood experiences as a contributing factor to sexual violence perpetration. How does that play into the continued cycle of sexual violence as children move into their adult life?
I think this is a critical phase, right, when we're talking about boys and the younger men in our communities, how we're really addressing what I call the trauma responses, right? The internalized trauma responses. And so if you look at our boys and our younger men, particularly black and brown boys, the punitive actions that are taken, the way that they are categorized and treated as adults. And we're doing this already in a world that's telling them that they don't belong. And so you couple that with also these teachings of the manhood where you don't show emotions, right? You don't express your feelings. You don't ask for help. You kind of, we use the phrasings like you man up. So we have to really consider when those things are coupled, how that's contributing to not only the response to their own trauma, right, and their own mental health, but how that's going to carry over into their relationships. And when we're talking about their relationships with intimate partners. And so they're finding this space as the only place that they can have control. And because that's what they've been taught, is that, again, I go back to the teachings of Manbox, that the control is like seeing women as less than as property and to be objectified. And so this is the only space where they're seeing themselves as like, I have some control, because in these other spaces, I don't. We have to be really aware when we're working with boys and young men that we're considering all these factors that are playing from their childhood experiences into their, they're coming into their manhood as teenagers, and how much of that narrative they're holding on to, right? That they think like, oh, this is what it means to be a man. And that's going to contribute in the future to how they respond to and how they treat women and girls. I think it's really important for us just to remember that we are working with men sometimes who cause harm by supporting them, right, with accountability and finding their voice. But we also have to consider that we're doing this in a society that has not taken accountability for how it has caused harm to them.
We are talking with Josue. He is a trainer with A Call to Men. Now, with so many unhealthy and misconstrued social norms about masculinity out there, how can we successfully get men and boys to engage in allyship?
The first thing is really how we frame the conversation, how we invite men into these conversations, into these spaces. And it's really for us at A Call to Men about an invitation, not an indictment on men. I think one of the things that has made us successful in engaging many populations and audiences of men is that we really meet men where they are, where they're at. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to co-sign, behavior, problematic behavior or comments, but we really are making the effort to meet men where they're at, to meet men where they're at around the conversations of manhood, their understanding of the man box and all these social norms. And so I think that is very critical to understand when we're, whatever the population or the audience that's in your community, is that you're really being mindful about the language and what the entry point conversation is to bring them to the table. I think one of the other things to consider as well is that when we're talking about men as aspiring allies, as we call it, right, is that we consider that this is work that never ends. There's not going to be a place for men that they arrive, that they're like, quote unquote, woke, right? And that they're a true ally. Because I think this is a journey that's lifetime's work. Men have to understand that. We as men have to understand that. This is how we show up every day, how our actions impact others every day. And I think being mindful of that is really important when we're talking about men to really step into their leadership and find their voice to, be of influence to other men, to other boys in their spheres.
What do you think are the most essential skills that a boy or young man needs in order to have healthy relationships and prevent sexual violence?
Here I'll say that it's the education for a dominant group, right? When we're talking about men in particular, right, in this work, that we men are the dominant group, right, in the patriarchal society. And so that requires that we're constantly creating spaces and providing education for ourselves, creating education for younger men in our community. And the key pieces that I've seen that are necessary in these conversations around education is that around consent and boundaries. Consent. I can't tell you enough how much this is needed, right? Like for us, we developed a Live Respect curriculum, right, that we use with middle school and high school boys. And from an initial pilot, we found that out of 300 boys in high school, that 81% of them did not know what consent was or did not know how to define it. And so really this is critical to understand the lack of information or just misinformation that is out there for our young men, right? And how much in our society, what the narrative has been is that no means try harder. And so I think it's important for us to always continue providing that education, providing the spaces to have those conversations. Because as, I'm not going to say older men, as more seasoned men, we have a responsibility to really model that healthy manhood, right? And how do we promote that? And how do we also model the ways to interrupt unhealthy manhood? Because I think it's not just a conversation about men that are perpetrating the violence. It's also a conversation of us as men who are seeing it, who are hearing it, but are staying silent, and we're not saying anything about it. And that's equally as violent.
A Call to Men offers a variety of different trainings in healthy masculinities. So what and when are they, and who all should be taking these trainings?
So our work unapologetically is with men and boys. We do see men and boys have a particular role and responsibility in preventing all forms of violence against women and girls. But our trainings are really open to all. When we talk about our work really, community organizing being at the heart of our work, we've had these trainings with advocates, with organizers, with coaches, mentors, and educators. And so it really is a conversation and trainings that are available to all communities, but we do particularly, are looking to do this education and these workshops with men, because men do have a particular way that they're going to be heard, especially with other young men in their communities. And we do feel that this is a way for men to find their voice, a way for men to find that platform and use it. And we do believe, like, once you know something, you can't pretend. And so the trainings that we do offer are really about finding ways to be upstanders and finding ways to be interrupters, the unhealthy forms of manhood that we see out in our society. And so I invite, in particular, men and boys to connect with us, to be part of this work. And because, and us doing this work does not mean that we also don't value the voices and experiences of women and non-male identified folks. But in us doing this work, we also have to recognize and we learn how we center those voices and those experiences in these conversations around health and manhood.
So we're going to get ready here to start wrapping things up. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I would just remind us again, as I mentioned, the work that we do is really about centering those in the margins of the margins. And that when we do that as men, that we really are talking about our collective liberation, right? That our liberation is directly tied to the liberation of women. And so we have to be at the table. We have to get in these conversations. We can't really wait to have the perfect response or always be afraid that we're going to get it right, because we're not, right? And so as I've mentioned, this is a journey. And as our CEO would mention, right, we're building and flying the plane at the same time. So we really just have to get in there, and we really don't have the luxury to figure it out and get it all right. We just have to get in there, because what's at stake is lives. Like, lives are being lost while we're trying to figure it out. And so we really have to feel the urgency of this issue. And I would also ask the men listening to really think about your circles of influence, because we all have influence. We all have a platform. And so I invite you to really think and pause on where that is, right? Is it in your church? Is it in your school if you're an educator? Is it other men in your life, in your family, right? And I really am asking you to step up to that role and step into that leadership.
Where can people find out more about A Call to Men if they want to find out more about your teachings, your trainings, just anything that you have to offer?
So you all can head over to acalltomen.org on our Fabulous website, and you'll find all the information as well around, our Circles of Influence, which is a gathering of different groups of men that we're going to be launching next year. You can also find our virtual institutes on there that are happening every other month next year as well. And there's also a space for young leadership, right? So there's different programs and ways for young folks to engage with us as well. And, we're always happy to be here as a resource too if folks have any questions. And I'd also invite folks to check out our Healthy Manhood group on Facebook. You can join us there for more in-depth conversations and sharing of resources from, many folks from across the world that are really invested in ending all forms of violence against all women and girls.
Josue Arguelles with A Call to Men. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really informative.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
This has been Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault. If you would like more information on this program, you may call our offices at 217-744-2560 or send me an email requesting more information at dbonner@prairiecasa.org. Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault supports children and adult survivors of sexual violence through counseling and legal advocacy and medical advocacy in 11 central Illinois counties. Prairie Center offers coaching boys into men for male high school and college athletes, bringing in the bystander training for college campuses, and sexual harassment prevention training for businesses and organizations within our area. Our main office is located in Springfield, Illinois, with satellite offices in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois, and you can find out more about our services at our website at prairiecasa.org. This program is supported by a grant from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Points of view or opinions contained in this program are those of Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of these grantors. Thank you for listening.